So some people have been asking me why I disliked ML Rio's If We Were Villains, and I realised that it's the first ever post that I made on this page, so I thought a good way of revisiting my opinions would be to react to my first ever post 8 months later. And yeah, let's talk about it. So I just finished If We Were Villains by ML Rio, and I was disappointed. Okay, immediately, what's going on with my hair? I mean, my skin is glowing. The skin, why does my skin look so nice? Is that a filter? It might be a filter, but still. There's a couple stains on my jumper as well, and I love that jumper. I don't know what those stains are. As someone who loves The Secret History, I just think this book takes a lot of inspiration. Now, what I will say is that when I picked up If We're Villains, I was still fresh off the heels of The Secret History, and I was still really buzzing about that book. And even now, it's a book that I really, really enjoyed. So I don't know how fair it is to review If We're Villains in comparison to The Secret History, because I think Emma Rio even says in the introduction that at the time of writing this book, dark academia, that subgenre didn't exist yet. So I don't know how fair that is, but I will say that it does feel a bit like an imitation novel. But it's very style over substance in the way that the characters are portrayed. They're so cartoonishly melodramatic. They say things and do things that just aren't based in reality. And what's especially jarring is they really remind you of those over-the-top theatre kids in real life that most people hate and don't want anything to do with. Yeah, so I think this is the root of my issue with the book. When you compare it to The Secret History, that book works so much better for a reading audience because you're dealing with people who are sort of like socially ostracized, like they don't have anything to do with the rest of their academy. They're this very small, close-knit group, and it makes sense that they're these like classics nerds that spend all of their time together studying Greek, studying Latin, like that makes sense. But in If We're Villains, the group are type A, intense theatre kids, and even though I don't care for that type of person, and I know lots of people who don't, typically they are on the more popular spectrum in a school, so it doesn't make sense that they're also this ostracized group that only stick to each other, because in reality they would be attractive, they would be confident and charismatic, they would have lots of friends outside of the group. So it doesn't really work having that same dynamic with this group because they're a completely different type of student. I think this book suffers from an identity crisis where it doesn't know what it's trying to tell us. You know, is it a murder mystery? Is it a love story? I couldn't tell you. Now, on this score, I actually disagree with Alfie from the Past. I think that the book does know what it wants to be. It's just not very successful in its delivery of that, partly because it wants to be so many different things, and the murder mystery really sort of consumes everything else. Like when you go in a bookshop, you see this book in the crime section, and it always just feels wrong to me because it should be in the more sort of like dark academia style, like gothic, fantastical. Like I would want it in a different. And I think if people are putting it in the crime section, that tells you that it's a bit confused. As for the love story bit, I mean, that is the most frustrating bit for me. The ending, I know some people adore the ending to If We're Villains. I find it to be shoehorned in. It's giving like queer bait, the way that the characters are suddenly like, oh no, suddenly gay. You know, they had feelings for each other all along. There wasn't enough evidence there for me to be like, oh yeah, there was some sort of relationship here that was more than platonic. I never once thought that. And so to whack that out, I guess to try and make a comparison to like the bi-erasure that happens with Shakespeare and people like asking like, oh, was Shakespeare queer? I don't care for it. I think it's a bit reductive in its use of Shakespeare. It could have gone so much deeper. This 1000%, more than anything else that I've said in this old post, it's very reductive in its use of Shakespeare, because I'm someone who adores Shakespeare, and I think that's why I put all of my hopes on this book being really good, because I know that ML Rio is someone who's also really passionate about Shakespeare. Like, she did Shakespeare studies at college, I think. So that doesn't convey in the book very well, and it's partly because they're actors, and so most of the time they're just speaking lines from the plays. You know, they're not really embodying it in a very thoughtful way. Like, in The Secret History, there are so many memorable conversations that the students have, and they really get into the minutiae of their subject. So much so that even if you know nothing about classics or ancient Greek, you're suddenly interested because they're so engaging. This doesn't have that at all. The only memorable conversation I can think of is when they talk about why Julius Caesar is considered a tragedy and not a history. That's the only memorable conversation that I can point to from the book. The rest of it is just blind quotations of, like, word for word from a play, which is not exciting, because if I wanted paragraphs and paragraphs of Shakespeare, I would just go read Shakespeare, you know? If you appreciate books at face value, then maybe you'll like this. Who knows? Why did I get so pointed at the end? I was so judgmental. I think what I'm trying to say is that this book, it has an aesthetic, which is why it took off. That's why people base their entire personality off of If We Were Villains, because the branding is successful. It's a very marketable book. Is there any discernible substance underneath all the style? No, probably not. If you scratch beneath the surface, you find, like, a poor imitation of The Secret History. And so what I'm trying to say there is that if you just take a book at face value, if you're, you know, if it's something to put on your Pinterest board, you'll love it, you know. If you want to actually have an in-depth conversation about it, maybe at your book club, I don't really know what you're going to talk about without just talking about Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is the real interesting bit in all of this. None of these characters are. They're like one-dimensional tropes that have grown legs and are walking about and pretending to be sad about their dead friend. So, yeah. It is a shame that I didn't like this book, because I even bought the special edition of If We're Villains. Like, I really banked on this being something that I was gonna love, and I think 8 months later I'm taken aback at how hit or miss the dark academia subgenre is, because I can think, like, oh, The Secret History, sensational. Babel, loved it. But then there's other books like this one where I'm just like, no, not for me. Don't really care for it. But it is fun to watch me talk about a book from 8 months ago. I feel like I'm a lot more confident in what I say here, and I'm not as trying to cram everything in. You can see, like, this original review is only 58 seconds long. I seem to think that you have to make everything less than a minute. I now talk for ages and ages. Like, this one will probably be just under 10 minutes. So yeah, it's fun to make progress.